Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we wrap up Stalking Awareness Month during the month of January. So it's an honor and privilege to be with all of you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's webinar. Just to give you a rundown of how today will work, I will be starting and we're going to talk about a few basic things before we give the mic and the stand over to our guest speaker, Debbie Riddle. It's an honor and privilege to work with her, and it's an honor and privilege to be able to talk to all of you today. For those of you that are not familiar with SPARC, we are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to do training and technical assistance on the issue of stalking all across the U.S. So in a pre-pandemic world, we provide in-person trainings. For now, we would direct you to our website. It's stalkingawareness.org. Many of you might be familiar with the website because you have been sharing social media posts and other efforts throughout the month of January. I would highly encourage you to get on our website if you haven't already done so. There's lots of things on there that I think you will find extremely helpful in your work with safety planning and working with victims of stalking, as well as trying to hold offenders accountable. So we have practitioner guides on our website, so things like advocacy guides, there's guides for prosecutors, there's guides for probation and parole officers, there's training modules on our website. So if you get the privilege of doing training in your community on the issue of stalking, you are more than welcome to get on our website and download pretty much a presentation in a box. It already has the PowerPoint and any slides that you would need, videos, activities. So you are more than welcome to use those in your efforts to create awareness about stalking. And then we have victim resources on our website. SPARC does not work with victims directly, so please do not send victims to our office to contact us, because we unfortunately then have to turn them back to their local programs. So we don't want victims to be running in circles trying to find help. So you can access resources for victims on our website that include things like safety planning, documents, documentation logs, and other resources. So please check those out. They're available in both English and in Spanish. And last but not least, especially during this month, we are in charge of Stalking Awareness Month promotion. So we have lots of things on our website that you can use to promote Stalking Awareness Month, but we would say stalking awareness shouldn't happen just in the month of January, but throughout the year. So please check out our resources, and we would encourage you to follow us on social media. We announce things on social media like upcoming webinars. We have lots of resources on social media. So you can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and our username on there is Follow Us Legally. And you can also sign up for our newsletter on our website, which will also alert you to new resources, to trainings that might be in your area, etc. So please visit us on social media or check out our website. And anything that we can do to assist you in your efforts, we are more than happy to do so. So I'm going to start our time off together just very briefly laying the foundation of some of the things that we're going to talk about today. One of the things that we know is that stalking is a relatively new crime, and those of us that are responding to stalking have really only had efforts to do so for about the last 25 years, which sounds like a long time, but compared to those efforts of domestic violence and sexual assault, we're a little bit further behind. And so one of the things that we know is that oftentimes we struggle to identify stalking in our work and really come up with a comprehensive way of responding to that behavior and talking about that behavior. So one of the things that we want to start off with today and grounding our work is to talk about what the definition is of stalking. And so we say that it's a pattern of behavior that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. And so I'm going to encourage all of you to use the chat right now to answer my questions. And the first question I would ask you is, if we say that stalking is a pattern of behavior, how many incidents are we looking for? How many incidents make up a pattern? I see 2, more than 1, 2 or more, 3 or more. Kind of like bingo right now. We've got lots of different answers, okay? And that's why we start with this definition, because we all have a different interpretation. Now, obviously, you might be from a state that has it spelled out in their statute that says it has to be 2 or more or 3 or more. Typically, if it's spelled out in a state statute, it says 2 or more, and that's the definition that we use in our behavioral definition, so 2 or more incidents. But the things that we have to be thinking about is that there may be a variety of tactics used by the offender. And you're going to hear Debbie talk about the variety of tactics that were engaged in by the offender in her sister's case. And so we might have one incident of the offender driving by the victim's house. We might have another incident of the offender sending the victim a text message. Those are 2 different behaviors, but there's still an overall pattern. So when we say the pattern exists, we don't need 2 text messages or 2 incidents of the offender driving by the victim's house. It can be different tactics. And we know that stalkers are extremely creative and that they oftentimes vary those tactics depending on the reaction that they're getting from the victim. So keep in mind, we don't need 2 of the same behaviors to establish a pattern. Then we say that stalking is directed at a specific person, but who else do we see impacted by the stalking besides the primary victim? Who else are you seeing being affected in your work? Family members? Yep. Children? Absolutely. Friends? Co-workers? I like how somebody said pretty much everyone in the victim's life. That's exactly right, right? We know that oftentimes offenders will turn to targeting people close to the victim's pets, the people the victim works with, in order to get a reaction from the victim. And so we need to keep in mind that oftentimes we might have multiple people who are affected by the stalking, not just the individual. And then we say would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Why is that in our definition? Do we not think that victims are reasonable people? Why do we say reasonable person to feel fear? Any thoughts? I can see some of you typing, so I'm not going to give you the answer until you give me the answer. Context, absolutely. Somebody said legal definition, and absolutely we see that reasonable person clause in lots of state statutes, but someone answered it exactly correct when we say it's many times focused on context. And what we have to keep in mind is that in stalking cases, context is extremely critical. And we also have to focus on that last piece of the definition, which is fear. And understanding that fear is subjective, and what might be scary to one person might not be scary to another person. And so when we look at our stalking cases, the thing we have to keep in mind is that context is extremely critical. In these cases, we have to understand that what might be scary for the victim might not be scary for other people, and that many times victims will minimize what's happening to them, or that they may have told somebody about what they're experiencing and they didn't get a reaction from that person that they were hoping for. That person might be like, well, are you blowing it out of proportion? Are you sure that this is really happening? And we see that both as a reaction from friends and family, but from those of us as responders as well. So as we move forward in our webinar today, I would encourage you to think about that context piece, as well as the fact that we see multiple behaviors engaged in by the offender in this particular case. So as I turn the mic over to Debbie, a couple of things. We would encourage you to ask questions throughout Debbie's presentation. You can put them in the chat, and then Debbie's going to pause throughout her presentation so that we can answer some of those questions, react to some of those questions. But it's my honor and my privilege today to turn the mic over to Debbie. And we actually have Stalking Awareness Month because of Debbie's efforts. So Debbie is an amazing advocate, amazing voice for those individuals who've experienced stalking. And we are privileged to be able to work with her. So I'm going to turn the mic over to her. And then, like I said, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll pause throughout her story. But for now, it's my privilege to introduce Debbie Riddle.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening. This has been amazing watching where everybody is, listening in to this. And I'm so appreciative of your time, that you have taken time out of your day to join us for this very important topic. I want to give a special shout out to someone who's listening in from Ohio University, where I spent the best 5 years of my life. And I want to thank Jen and SPARC. I love that I can continue what I started 18 years ago on behalf of my sister, and I'm still able to, tell the story and share it with so many, and to see what a difference Peggy's story is making. So to begin with, I'll give you a little background about myself. I was born and raised in a small town in Northeast Ohio. I'm the oldest of 4 children. I went to Ohio University. I was there for 5 years. I got my degree in graphic design. Started out in medical and ended up in graphic design. So my parents weren't exactly crazy about that, but I left the small town and moved to Cleveland, Ohio, got a job in the ad business, and found myself working in advertising as a designer. Absolutely loved it. Took a job with another agency, and then was married. My husband and I, began to raise a family. Ran through some struggles with, trying to raise young children, working in advertising full time, and eventually ended up quitting my job and starting a freelance business. And I did freelance for about 15 or 16 years, as I raised the girls until I went just recently back into the workforce. So you're wondering, okay, so you have an art degree and you did graphic design and you work for ad agencies. How in God's name did you end up here today talking about stalking? So I like to say I think I was the right person in the right place at the right time. I did not choose this profession. I think the profession chose me. I think that I was probably a person that was able to deliver a message that, my sister and many other victims really couldn't articulate. So when my sister called me on the day that she left her abusive boyfriend, and she said, you're never going to believe what he's doing to me. He's stalking me. And I said to her, you know what, this is easy to handle. I got this, because shortly after I left college, I had been dating someone who was relatively abusive. It took me a while to figure out, because it was very psychological abuse. I was never physically harmed. I didn't look at myself as an abused victim. But after I cut ties with this person, he kept showing up at work and calling the front desk at work. I'd just gotten my first job, and following me, and I never ever said I'm being stalked. I just said, oh, this guy's creeping me out. He's creepy behavior. He's unnerving me. I happened to be talking to a really good friend of mine who was a police officer, and I was explaining this behavior to him. And he said, you know what's happening to you? And I was like, no. And he said, well, he's stalking you. I said, okay, great. How do we get this to stop? And he said to me, get an order of protection in place. And those papers were served. And I saw him one afternoon as I was walking to a coffee shop, and he turned around and walked the other way. So I thought, this is how it works. You call the police, you get the order of protection, and they stop. So when my sister had told me this, I thought I had the perfect solution to her problem. And I'll go back into, how Peggy met Patrick. Peggy was 32 years old, I think 28 years old when she met Patrick. And she had been living in Italy for about a year, and had gotten married to a gentleman, and they came back to the States, and they were going to be married in the States, and their relationship dissolved. So Peggy was out in Albuquerque, and her family, we were all in Ohio, and Peggy ended up staying out there and thought, I'm going to continue on, take some classes, and I want to go to medical school. So while she was at the University of New Mexico, she met this gentleman, Patrick Kennedy. And Patrick, wanted to date her. The dating was very, what I call traditional dating, like, hey, let's go to a movie, let's go out to dinner. Peggy had told me about this guy she met. They were in a study group together. Peggy was out there teaching yoga and taking classes, and things seemed to be okay. And Peggy came back to Ohio for Christmas. So this was in, 97, I think. So think, if you can, about a world without smartphones. I think we had AOL dial-up at the time. So if you remember that. I don't think Google was a thing, or Yahoo. I don't remember any of that being around. So I think when you had to do some homework on stalking people and location, you might have had to drag out the yellow pages. So Peggy comes home for Christmas, and she's home about a week, and right before New Year's, the doorbell rings. And I open up the door, and there's a guy with a suitcase standing on my mother's front porch. It's like, well, who the hell are you? Peggy's coming down the stairs, and the look on her face was a little bit unnerving. She was looking at Patrick like, what are you doing here? How did you find me? And he said, hey, I'm here to surprise you. That's the way he framed it, and walked into my mother's house. I turned back again, and I looked at Peggy like, not too sure about this. The one thing I can say about this moment in time is trust your gut, always. I cannot emphasize that enough. When something doesn't feel right, it is not right. In this short time that Patrick had spent with our family, mind you, he was not invited, he was very swiftly beginning to wedge some space in between Peggy and her family. He was very hovering. He was over-friendly, kind of had his nose in everybody's business. We went to my other sister's for New Year's Eve, and he said, this is my other sister. He said, well, it looks like I picked the wrong sister to sleep with. And I just, something just did not sit right with me about this man. And, Peggy went back to Albuquerque. Patrick went back, and they ended up moving in together. And so they lived together for 3 years. And during this time, I saw Peggy's personality start to disintegrate. If you look at this amazing picture that you see on the screen of Peggy, this is not what she looked like after a few years in this relationship. And I was getting messages from her that things weren't quite right. Like, oh, what do you and your husband fight about? So I knew there were some battles that were going on. I knew that she would be get ready to go either to class or a job interview and be dressed, and he would say, well, you look like a slut, or you're dressed like a whore today. No one's going to hire someone as stupid as you are. But then he would apologize. We'd tell her he was sorry. We'd take her out to dinner. We'd buy her roses. And I was getting little snippets of these conversations that were happening. And Peggy had wanted to join us on a vacation. We vacationed down at the Outer Banks for several years, and Peggy was going to come and fly into Raleigh and meet us down in the Outer Banks. And she shows up, and he shows up with his young daughter from another marriage. And so they spend a week with us. Another invasion of family life. Again, I'm seeing this man as almost as Peggy's supervisor. He's laying down these rules that Peggy's not sharing with us, but I know that they exist. Like, you will not go out with your sisters. You will not spend time with your family. You will not go out to dinner. All of these things, unless he was involved. And the sister who, loved to swim in the ocean and play on the beach with her nieces and interact with her family, all of that was gone. And I observed this for 7 days straight, and it was very painful to watch. And I remember having one conversation with her, about him being down there, and she says, well, he did pack a gun with him. I said, why would you bring a gun to the Outer Banks? Nothing is down here. Well, it's just for our safety. And that was another, there's all these red flags that were being thrown at me. And then again, it was this gut instinct of this guy is just not right for you. And like I said, she's a big girl. She's out, in Albuquerque trying to, get her life together and kind of move forward, but she's locked into this terrible relationship, and she tries to leave. And she's talking to my other sister about leaving. And at the time, my sister was going out to Las Vegas to spend a couple days out there with her husband. And they had said to Peggy, get on a plane and come out to Las Vegas and spend some time with us. Peggy said, all right, that's what I'll do. So Peggy gets her things and she goes to the airport, bound and determined that she's going to go to Las Vegas, but she spends all day puking in the airport. She can't get on that plane. She's terrified, absolutely terrified. Terrified, always I think of, what is my punishment going to be if I decide to leave? What is my punishment going to be if I break the rules? And we just didn't understand. We did not understand what she was going through. We didn't understand why she just wouldn't pack up her stuff and leave. And, again, like I said, he just kept driving a wedge between Peggy and her family, and he was also doing it to her friends. He was just making sure that she had nobody to turn to but him. He was doing a very good job of kind of cocooning Peggy, in with him into his world. So the final straw was in November of 2001. Peggy was to come home for a childhood friend, a girl that she had known since kindergarten, was getting married, and she was coming back to Cleveland, Ohio for this wedding. And we were excited because it was just Peggy, and she was in the bridal party, and we get to spend time with her. Well, Patrick went ahead and found out about this wedding and canceled Peggy's flight. And, he posed it as, like, I really want to join you. I really want to be with your family. I really want to enjoy this time with you. So he booked a flight for both him and Peggy. And he also found out the hotel that we were staying at and decided, well, that's not going to happen. I'm going to book a different hotel across the street where just you and I will be staying. So they both come home. And again, I see him show up and I'm like, what the hell is he doing here? He's not invited to this event. And he's in my house. And he's interacting with my two young girls, and he is making my skin crawl. And again, I'm still wondering, why haven't you left him? So, he shows up at this wedding. Peggy doesn't get to spend much time with us. Peggy doesn't really get to spend much time doing anything. And I can remember standing in the hallway, and he was talking. I did not want to have anything to do with him, and I don't have a really good way of hiding my expressions on my face. And so he was telling a story, and I looked at him like, you're an idiot. And I'll tell you what, the look he gave me was, if I could, I would kill you. And I just walked away from him, telling Peggy, I don't know how you put up with him. And it was shortly after that November wedding that she had called me and was saying that she was going to leave. So at this point, is there anything that anybody wants to ask me about, this abusive relationship? And I can tell you really quickly that no, I never saw my sister injured. She never talked about any physical injury, but I know there was a lot of emotional abuse.
Maybe I'm not seeing anything come up in the chat, but please go ahead. There's a couple people typing. Participants are identifying things as far as like red flags and pointing out, that Patrick was manipulative and controlling. Someone's asking how long they were together.
They were together just over 3 years.
Okay. And other folks identifying, again, the emotional abuse and the overprotective. Several people are typing right now, so give them a chance to have those questions come through. How many times did she try to leave was one of the questions.
Well, she tried to leave. I guess when my sister was out in Vegas, that was one attempt. Another attempt was maybe shortly after that when she was going to just come back to Ohio. The problem with that was I think she probably thought she was going to put our family in danger. And then the actual third time when she did pack up her things and actually physically leave.
Great. Another question was, were other family members besides you noticing some of the gut feelings about Patrick? Did they have the same feelings about him?
Oh, absolutely. Now, my other sister, now Peggy and my other sister Marilyn were closer in age. They were, closer. And the one thing that Marilyn picked up on was that Patrick wanted to take Peggy to Germany to meet his mother. His parents were divorced on New Year's Eve, and Marilyn went off the deep end and said, no one's going to believe me about this guy until Peggy comes home in a body bag. So absolutely, we had bad feelings about him.
There's also questions about, did he control her financially?
I don't know. I can't say that, 100% he did, but because they were living together and he had access to all of her personal information, quite possibly.
And other people are curious about, do you have any idea like how soon that abusive behavior started after they got together?
From judging the fact that he came into our home very early on in the relationship, which they had only been dating maybe about 2 months, and that I saw that kind of controlling behavior immediately, I want to say, it probably was kind of gradual, and maybe Peggy didn't see it as controlling off the get-go, but it couldn't have been too far into the relationship that this started because, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, he had an ex-wife, and I'll talk about what happened in their relationship.
Awesome. And that's leading into some of the other questions, which somebody had asked, did you know anything about his previous relationship? So I know that you'll probably answer that coming up. So hold on for that question, folks. And lots of acknowledgement and thanking you for sharing this story. So I want to point that out. Other folks asking, okay, again, about the previous relationship, so I know you're going to cover that. And someone asking, were there any signs in his personality that were problematic even before he was in the relationship with Peggy? So anything about his background with his ex-partner, which I think you're going to also cover. Oh, somebody wants to know how they met.
They met in a study group at the University of New Mexico when Peggy was taking some additional undergraduate classes to go on to medical school.
Okay. And some questions around, and those of us that work in the domestic violence field can understand this. There's some questions about that difficulty of, being able to recognize some of the things that were happening and some of those red flags, and then how difficult is that conversation to have with Peggy? And if those conversations did have, and were occurring, like what were some of her reactions when those things were pointed out? I think you said earlier, you believe that Peggy was worried about his impact on the family. And do you think that was one of the concerns why she hesitated to be able to end that relationship?
Yeah, and when, I would bring it up, she would get very defensive with me. Like, you don't know him, and you don't know what's going on in our lives, and she would tend to downplay it. And I know my other sister and her had gotten into stuff, especially around that New Year's Eve trip to Germany. She just did not want her to go. And, when I look back with my mom, it was like, well, she's 28 years old. What are you going to do? Ground her? Making her own decisions. We just didn't think that it would get as dangerous as it did. And yes, she did go. She ended up going to Germany with him and spending New Year's Eve. And I will tell you this: the apple doesn't fall far from the tree with his mother, because the mother, when Peggy broke up with Patrick, the mother called Peggy and said, you know, you better get the hell out of Dodge or I'm going to come over there and take care of you myself. So that paints a little bit picture about his family life.
Absolutely. And folks in the chat are doing a good job of identifying that, you know, when we talk about stories like that, it's easy to, you know, ask those questions of like, well, why did she just leave, or why, you know, all those things that society asks, and then really having a good understanding that it's not that easy, right? Like when you're involved in a relationship like that and, you know,
right.
being able to identify what's going on, hindsight's always 20/20, right? And as family members, it's easy to be frustrated and, you know, have concern, but also, like you said, you know, she was 28 years old. Your mom can't ground her, right? She could live her own life, her own decisions. So I think everybody in the chat is doing a really good job of understanding that when that domestic violence is in play, there's so much going on that we don't know, right? And that does keep individuals in those relationships. And so one of the ways that we often talk about it when we talk about stalking is not necessarily, you know, questions like why didn't she leave, which can come across as victim blaming, but what kept her there, right? What were the things that were keeping her in that relationship? And you've done a great job of explaining, you know, the connections that she had, and she was trying to make it work and those types of things. But anything else you want to add in that respect, Debbie?
No, because I'm going to kind of get into a little bit about the moment she left and actually what he put her through, you know, at that moment. So you can really, really see how manipulative he was. And this, you know, and when I talk to students a lot, I'm like, this relationship is not based on love. It's based on power and control. And we have to keep these things in mind a lot of times when we're looking at stalking cases.
Absolutely. And just going, lots of folks in the chat, so good understanding of what's going on. Several folks divulging that even from what you've said, they can identify that they might have family members or people that they're close to who might be in relationships like this. And so certainly we're going to give you all some resources at the end of the webinar and places that you can connect with to assist in these particular issues, finding your local domestic violence and sexual assault program. Somebody's asking about Peggy's relationship with Patrick's daughter from his previous relationship.
So at the time they had, Patrick and his ex-wife had shared custody of this girl. She was about 8 years old, and Peggy was really, really good to her. You know, she was this girl that was sort of just tossed between her parents. Her mom was, you know, busy in a new relationship, and then, you know, then there was Patrick doing whatever he was doing, and she was kind of lost a little bit. So Peggy had a really great relationship with her, did a lot of things, you know, with her and for her, and Patrick had always painted his ex-wife as this crazy, you know, controlling psycho bitch. So, and we're going to see when we talk about it a little later, you know, really what she truly was like. But Peggy did have a good relationship with her at the time, the daughter.
That's great. And then another question, you had mentioned, you know, the way that you kind of saw Peggy, like the spark go out of her, I think is the way that you describe it. And somebody was asking if there were other things that you noticed, like, you know, did her clothing change? Was she, you know, gaining or losing weight? Like a little bit more about the emotional impact and psychological impact?
And I'll probably repeat this, but when Peggy came home, and then we're talking about a year into the stalking. I mean, she was so thin, wasn't eating, was hypervigilant, wasn't sleeping well, wasn't comfortable being around our family. I mean, I had 2 young daughters at the time. My sister had a young daughter. I mean, her nieces adored her, but I know she was kind of hesitant to be with them because she was always afraid of what would he do to me, or what is he going to do to these young girls, or what's he going to do to our family. So extremely hypervigilant. You know, when phones would ring, she would didn't like standing in front of windows or doors. Just so far from what I knew her as a person.
Thanks, Debbie. I think we've answered a lot of the questions, so feel free to go on.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's talk about the day that she decided to actually leave him. Now, Patrick was a landscaper, so he worked for himself, so he was kind of just doing his own thing and not accountable to anybody. But Peggy sought out the opportunity when he was gone to throw as much of her belongings into a car, and she had found an apartment somewhere else and scooted over there and dropped, started leaving her belongings there, and she came back, and when she came back, he had come home and had already changed the key code on the garage, and he had barricaded the front door and called police. So he's setting the stage already. So when the police arrived, he said, "Oh my gosh, I'm terrified. Someone's trying to break in. I'm afraid. I'm afraid to be here by myself. I'm afraid for Peggy. I don't think she should leave. I think this is putting her in danger." And he's putting on this great performance in front of law enforcement. And the officer, unfortunately, stood between Peggy and Patrick and looked at Peggy and said, "Peggy, is there anything else that you want to tell me?" And Peggy looked at Patrick and then looked at the police officer and said, "No, officer, I want to get my things and I want to go." And so, Peggy said the look that Patrick had given her at that moment was, "You say one word and I'll kill you." So nothing was ever pursued at that moment. Peggy was never taken aside, separately from Patrick with the officer to talk more about, why she was packing up her car and leaving. So Peggy had packed up her things, got this new apartment, and the stalking begins. And it began with, because he didn't know where she was at, so he started with phone calls, and he would call her 10 times a day, 20 times a day, 50 times a day, and the calls were very, very much like how the relationship went, where he would call and tell her he loved her, and call and say he missed her, and then call and say, "Fucking whore, pick up the phone. Call me back, you big bitch. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Please call me back. His daughter, she needs to see you. We want to be with you. We miss you. Whore, pick up the phone." And you get the picture. This just went on and on and on. And Peggy was never picking up the phone. She was trying to, go about her day as normal as possible. And then he was showing up where she was working. He would show up at her yoga studio. And it was just surveillance. He would just sit there and watch her, wait for her to come out of work or wait for her to get done with the yoga class. She was not engaging with him at all. And one day walking into work, he was hiding in the bushes and he jumped out and he had a dozen red roses and a wedding ring, an engagement ring. And he said, "I love you. Will you marry me?" And Peggy walked right by him and didn't acknowledge him. So at this moment, he's not mourning the loss of the love of his life. He's extremely pissed off that he does not have power and control anymore. So because he's not getting any response from the phone calls and the surveillance and the roses and the rings, he's going to take the stalking behavior to another level. And what we often see with stalking is that behavior will tend to escalate over time. So what he does at this point is he takes a picture of Peggy and he puts it on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and underneath it he writes, "I'm a slut, I'm a whore, I've had 2 abortions and counting, I'd love to sleep with you, I've slept with so many boyfriends, call me." And he put Peggy's cell phone number on it. And he made this flyer, and he made about 300 of them and put them throughout the city of Albuquerque, many places where he knew Peggy would see them. And one of them was her yoga studio. And when she walked in, they handed it to her and they said, "I'm sorry, I have to be the one to tell you this, but this was taped to our front door this morning when we came in." So Peggy, this was about March maybe, so about 3 months into the stalking. Peggy has had enough with the phone calls, with the surveillance, with the following, now this flyer. So, and at this time Peggy had also begun dating someone else whose name was Mark, and Peggy was very clear and said, I have a stalker from a previous relationship. He's relentless. I'm just telling you that. And Mark was like, "I got this. It's fine. No big deal." So Peggy and Mark had gone to the police with Peggy's phone records and this flyer, and the police said, there's nothing we can do about it. It's a piece of paper. Come back to us, when something happens. So they left. And in June of that year, this is in 2002, our whole family was going to Florida for my brother's wedding. Patrick knew about this wedding. And just before the wedding, he had called my brother and left him a voicemail and said that he was sorry that he couldn't be at the wedding, that he wished nothing for the best for my brother and his wife, and hoped that the family had a beautiful day, and he was just sorry that things, with Peggy and him didn't work out, and left it at that. So while we are all in Orlando at this wedding, Patrick decides to get on a plane and fly to Youngstown, Ohio, and drive to my mother's house and spray paint PK as a whore on my mother's garage door. And the day after, our neighbors had called my mother and told her about what they had found on the garage door and taken a photo of it, and my mother went and filed a police report. And 2 days after that, we were all at dinner, and it was at a time nobody had a phone on them because there was no Instagram, so nobody had to take a picture of the food they were eating. And we came out of dinner, and Peggy had a call on her cell phone, and Mark, Peggy's boyfriend, had like six or seven missed calls. And it was Albuquerque police, Albuquerque fire, his mother, his neighbor. Someone had set fire to Mark's house. And Peggy had called Albuquerque police and said, we know exactly who did that. That's my stalker. Peggy and Mark had gone back to Albuquerque. The fire was under investigation. They were investigating it as an arson. Peggy is saying the reason why there's arson is because I have a stalker. Peggy went behind Mark's house. They had opened a gas line and then set flame to the gas line and burned some of the back of the house off. And Peggy said to the detective, look at these boot prints. These are Patrick's boots. I know these are Patrick's boots because, number one, he walks with his left foot out, and number two, I gave him these boots for Christmas a couple of years ago. Go to his house and find the boots. I'm sorry, ma'am. This is an arson investigation. We'll handle this. So, we started back in January with, phone calls, harassing phone calls, and now we're in June and we've got an arson. So at this point, Peggy decides, I'm going to file for an order of protection, and I'm filing stalking charges. So she gets herself an attorney, and she goes in to get an order of protection. Well, Patrick goes in, and he gets an order of protection out on her. And he tells the judge that Peggy is a danger and a threat to him, that she's a drug addict, that she's abusive, that she is a danger to his daughter, and she needs to be kept away from him. So the judge has Peggy and Patrick in court and says, look, you need to stay away from him and you need to stay away from her. And they walk out of court, and Patrick looks over at Peggy and says, I told you not to fuck with me. Patrick had done this before, like I mentioned earlier, and he had done this to his ex-wife. When they were prior to them divorcing, and his ex-wife had thrown him out, he began stalking her. So there were about 7 police reports that she had filed, and one was that he showed up at their house and taken a glass cutter and cut all the windows on her home and on her car. Filed a report for that. He had showed up another time and had dumped red oil-based paint all over the property. She filed another police report. There were some mentions of potential, I don't even know what the term is, some sexual assault with a minor with his daughter. So the courts had gotten involved where there was a guardian ad litem appointed, and he had to have supervised visitation. The last report she filed, she had written on the back of it, "He is stalking me. He's not going to be happy until he kills me or kills our young daughter." Those reports sat somewhere in someone's drawer in the city of Albuquerque, and at this point, no one was looking at them. And after the order of protection was filed, the courts even stepped in and said that in order for Patrick to keep visitation with his daughter, that they wanted to do a psychological evaluation. And Patrick said, "Forget it. I give up my rights. I don't care. You're not going to evaluate me, no matter what you say." So they get this order of protection in place, and on both of them, and they're trying to decide what to do. And now we know that there's going to be a trial. So Peggy is working with an attorney, as well as Patrick is working with an attorney. So up to this point, before I get into what happens while Peggy's waiting for the trial, do we want to stop and ask any more questions about some of the stalking behavior or tactics, or what Peggy went through in those? That was about 6 or 7 months worth of her life.
So Debbie, a lot of the conversations in the chat right now are focused on civil protection orders. So just a quick blurb about civil protection orders and whether they do or do not work. Statistics will show us in stalking cases that sometimes they do work, sometimes they don't work. Obviously, in this case, it hasn't been working. Several of you have been putting in the chat that you haven't seen them as effective. One of the things that we always want to be thinking about is what happens in one jurisdiction might not be true in other jurisdictions. And so we're talking about some of the options that are available. Whether they work or do not work is going to depend on the offender, right? And the reaction from law enforcement, et cetera. And other folks are expressing frustration with the system and how that all plays out. Just to clarify, civil protection orders are different from criminal no contact orders. Civil protection orders are things that you apply for through the court system. If the offender violates that order and they're arrested, then it's a criminal charge. So depending on whether things show up on a criminal record, et cetera, the violation of the protection order would, on a criminal record, the recipient and actually applying for the protection order might not show up on a criminal record. So it's really going to be case dependent on your jurisdiction. So we're not going to go too far down that particular rabbit hole just because we're happy to answer questions about your specific jurisdiction if you have those, but would definitely say for those of you that are questioning that and asking, check with the local victim advocates who can explain that process and what it's like and how you, apply for a civil protection order, et cetera, in your jurisdiction. So other than that, I don't see any questions specifically about some of the behaviors, Peggy, so I think you can go ahead and go on, and then we'll, if people do have questions about some of those behaviors, they can go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll answer them when you pause next.
Okay. So at this point, actually, after the arson happened, I was like, oh, thank God, like an arson, like a real, tangible, dangerous crime. He's going to get nailed for this one, and then he didn't. And so then there was, Peggy got an attorney and a trial date, and we were like, all right, yes, he's going to trial. This is going to be great. So we kept putting our faith in the criminal justice system, and it just kept letting us down over and over again. So this is in August, and the trial was to happen in October, pushed into November, and then pushed into January. So at the time, Peggy was working in pharmaceutical sales, and Mark and Peggy thought it would be best to get out of Albuquerque until the trial. So they moved her out to Turlock, California. Peggy could live just about anywhere. So she was out there, moved her stuff out there to an undisclosed location. My mother knew her address, so like any incoming mail, she would be able to get it out to Peggy. I think Peggy had switched. She had a landline. She never answered it, and she had switched cell phones at this point. So she's out in California, waiting for the trial, and now Patrick can't find her. So now what's he supposed to do with his time? Well, he decides a couple different things. First of all, he starts working with a private investigator, and there is a lot of chatter via email about where this girl might be and who she is and why he needs to find her. And Patrick had never given this private investigator any money. I think he was trying to see how much information he could get for free before, he was going to have to ante up some cash. So he was working that angle, was kind of coming up with some dead ends. And then somehow he found out who Peggy's moving company was, because he knew that she wasn't in Albuquerque anymore. So he posed as a police officer. He called the moving company and said his name was Officer Galuli, and he had recovered some of Miss Klinke's stolen items. Could they please give him Miss Klinke's most current address, and he would get those items to her. And the woman who answered the phone, by the grace of God, doing her job, said, "I'm sorry, officer, I cannot give out that information, but if you bring in Miss Klinke's items, we'll be sure to get them to her." And he said, "You know what, never mind, we're good." So seriously, what police officer readily admits, like, I'm just going to keep this person's stolen items? So this girl calls Peggy and talks to her, and Peggy said, nothing was ever stolen from me. That's got to be my stalker, Patrick Kennedy. So when Peggy had moved out to California, she also had a picture of Patrick with him and had kind of showed a few of her neighbors this picture and said, I have a stalker. We're going to trial. If you see him around here, call police. She had tried to get her order of protection transferred out to California. There was some difficulty with that. It wasn't entered into a national database. Patrick's attorney wanted Peggy's most current address so he could put them on his official documents, and Peggy's attorney said, no, I'm not giving you that information. So, there was a lot of different, there was a lot of different ways that Peggy was trying to maintain safety, and a lot of different ways that Patrick was, working his way through the system to try and find her. So he wasn't getting much in the way of posing as a police officer. He wasn't getting much from the private investigator, so he started posing as a private investigator, and he knew the company that Peggy worked for and somehow got the cell phone of one of her colleagues and said, I'm looking for Miss Klinke. I need to talk to her about some finances. And this girl was like, off the cuff, said, I have no idea who you're talking about. I've never heard of that girl. And he said, okay, never mind. If you run into her, don't tell her I called. Well, this girl did know Peggy and called Peggy immediately. And Peggy said, that's my stalker, Patrick Kennedy. Don't give him any information. So, like I said, he's working really hard. He's coming up empty-handed. And Thanksgiving of that year, this was Thanksgiving of 2002, our family was always at my mom's house in Poland, Ohio for Thanksgiving, and I had just come in with my two girls. And it was the night before Thanksgiving, and they had gone to bed, and the phone rings like around 10 o'clock. It's like, all right, I'll answer that. And I pick it up, and it's Patrick. And he says, I know where she's at. In 2 minutes, she'll be dead. I had known at the time that Peggy was in Albuquerque. I thought, oh, my God, he's standing out in front of Mark's house with a gun. I also thought maybe he thinks she's at home, and maybe he's standing in my mother's backyard with a gun, and he's going to open fire. I call Albuquerque police. I send them to Mark's house. I stay on the phone with dispatch. I find out that Peggy is safe. I ask them to please find out where these phone calls are coming from. I don't know if he's in Ohio expecting Peggy to be home. I don't know if he's in Albuquerque. And no one could do that for me. No one could figure out where the call was coming from. So I called, Peggy said, call the district attorney. I called the district attorney. I left him a message. I filed another police report of a death threat phone call. We sent that out to Albuquerque. Peggy got a call the next day. she actually called the district attorney, and he picked up the phone and heard her voice, and he started laughing at her, and he said, "Oh my God, you're still alive?" This is what my sister is getting from our criminal justice system. This is the message of, we're not protecting you, we're protecting the offender. So at Christmas time of 2002, Peggy comes home for the holidays, and like I had said before, thin, hypervigilant, not sleeping, not eating, happy to be home with her family, yet not happy to be with us because, like I said, I felt like she was, she felt like she was putting us in harm's way by being with us. And on top of that, we had gotten a phone call from Patrick's sister-in-law, his brother's wife, and said she had told my mom, I know Peggy probably comes home for Christmas, but we can't find Patrick. You might want to call your local law enforcement and put a watch on your house. This is the family that had witnessed his behavior for years. This is the brother that when my sister talked to him and said, do you really think he would kill me? And the response was, well, he might kill you, but I think if he was going to kill someone, he might kill my dad first. So when Peggy leaves my house shortly after New Year's Day, tears in her eyes, and I said, just hang on. We have 20-some more days. Get back to California, get to work. So back to California she goes, back to work she goes, and we're all just holding our breath waiting for this trial. And the trial was to be, I want to say, like January, maybe 26th about. And on Saturday morning, January 18th, Peggy is walking out of her front door to meet a friend for coffee. Actually, she's walking into her garage before meeting this friend, and as she walks into the garage, Patrick had been hiding in the garage and walked into her condo. And are there any questions that you want to talk about before? Is there anything that has come up that we want to talk about before I get into this last segment?
Debbie, I think the just resounding theme in the chat is the frustration with the system response, and folks, asking, when did this occur? Has it changed since? And we're going to get into all of that.
Okay.
But just for clarification, Debbie, do you want to tell them like the year that we're looking at, just so as we think about this, the next questions about whether things have or have not changed?
Yeah, this was all of this transpired from 98 to 2003, January of 2003.
Okay, perfect. So as folks are typing, we're going to go on to the next piece of things. So hold on just a second. All right, Debbie, you can go ahead.
Okay. So, one of the questions is like, oh my God, how did he find her? So he worked with a private investigator. He worked as a private investigator. The private investigator that he was working with gave him a street name, but it was a very, very long street name that traveled through many communities up the coast of California. And Patrick had been packing a rifle and a handgun, duct tape, rope, fake business cards that he had made saying he was a private investigator. And he had flown back and forth between Albuquerque and San Jose, and he started casing these little towns, going up through Modesto and Turlock, and stumbled across a UPS driver. And Peggy, working in pharmaceutical sales, kind of hit the jackpot. And he had said to the UPS driver, he had Peggy's picture, and he also had a fake document where he had forged Peggy's name. And he said, look, I gotta get a check for $10,000 from this woman. I need to find her for my client. And the UPS driver said, I can't give that to you. I'm not allowed to give that information out. And Patrick said, look, here's my card. If you change your mind, just give this to me, give me her contact information, whatever you know, and I'll be eternally grateful. I have to pick up this check from her. So later that evening, the UPS driver caved and gave Patrick, my sister's exact address. So on that Saturday morning, while my entire family is in Ohio getting ready to plan my niece's 6th birthday, Peggy walks into her garage and Patrick surprises her. He has a handgun. He beats her over the head with his handgun and throws her up against her kitchen wall where she falls to the floor. He is able to put duct tape over her mouth so no one's going to hear her scream. He is able to turn her over and duct tape her wrists together. And I'm sure he was going to drive her out into the middle of nowhere and leave her for dead. And I think that way often because at that time the Lacey Peterson case was going on a town over. And I just wonder some days if maybe she was going to be the next, missing girl in that case, because at the time she was just missing. They didn't know anything more. But fortunately, Peggy, not only strong-willed but strong physically, was able to get her wrist out of the tape and pull the tape off her mouth. Her friend was at the front door, knocking on the front door, thinking they were going to go have coffee, and Peggy ran out just covered in blood, screaming. And she grabbed Rachel, and they ran to Rachel's condo, and they were able to lock the door, and Peggy was able to pick up the phone. She was able to call 911. So I want to take a quick break while we go ahead and listen in on the 911 call that Peggy was able to make.
911 emergency. I have a stalker. He's here to kill me. He's already beat me up and taped me. He's in my house. 1410, number 118 is what he said. Who's there? Patrick Kennedy. He's beating me up with a gun. He's trying to break it down. Does he have a gun right now? He already beat my head. If you don't get her, he's going to kill both of us. Okay, we're on the way, ma'am. Now. Are they on the way? They're on their way. Quickly. My head is stopping wet with blood. He is in this house. He's going to kill us. Stay on the line with me, ma'am. I'm staying on the line. Oh, my God. How close are they? They're on their way. Patrick, I'm the only one here. He ran. Please. Stop it. Female. Please stop it. I think he's going to kill me. Is he, ma'am?
So that was a call that Peggy was able to make upstairs in Rachel's condo. While she was making that call, Patrick breaks in. He breaks through the sliding glass doors. Now, he doesn't know that Rachel is upstairs hiding in the closet. And he comes in thinking he's just going to find my sister. And he's got Peggy to the floor with the gun to the back of her head. And the SWAT team arrives. And they are outside the door, and they're trying to talk to Patrick, and they're trying to engage conversation with him, and he's not having any of it. And Peggy, in a very calm, very collected way, tells the officers, don't come in here. If you come in here, he's going to shoot me. I need you to get a hold of my mother in Poland, Ohio, and tell her I love her. I have a young niece who's been sick all winter. Please tell her she'll have a guardian angel watching over her. I also have a sister who's pregnant. And can you tell her, please, to name the baby after me? And the officer says, Peggy, let's not talk about things like that. Let's talk about, your family. And with that, Patrick sees Rachel at the back of the closet. And for a second, he puts the gun down, and he tells her to get the hell out of the room. And as Rachel gets up and starts walking out the door, he fires shots at the officer that's standing outside of the door, and they get Rachel out safely. The door shuts. Patrick shoots Peggy in the back of the head, and then he turns the gun and shoots himself. And the officers come in, immediately pull Peggy out. Peggy dies on her front lawn moments later, and Patrick, of course, is proclaimed dead at the scene. This is on a Saturday morning in California, and we have no idea that any of this is happening when we're in Ohio. And I remember saying, I called Peggy this morning. I haven't heard back from her. And my sister said, I left her a voicemail. My mom's like, oh, it's Saturday. She's probably busy doing things. She'll probably call you later. And about 9 o'clock that evening, just after I had put my girls to bed, the doorbell rings at my mom's house. And I was kind of terrified to answer the door because, number one, no one rings the doorbell in my mother's house. And two, I always had a fear of walking down the long hallway of my mother's house thinking that Patrick was going to stand on the front porch and shoot who was ever coming down that hallway, specifically my mother. I thought often that if he couldn't find Peggy, he was going to kill my mom. But when I turned the corner, I saw 2 police officers standing at my mother's front porch, and I opened up the door and very calmly said, "Did Patrick Kennedy kill my sister?" I knew from the moment I saw the officer's badge what had happened. And that evening, I was able to talk to an officer out in Turlock who had told me what had happened. The next few days, as we're trying to plan Peggy's funeral and trying to get her body from California back to Ohio, I just kept thinking over and over again, how did this happen? I mean, how did this happen? She was in touch with law enforcement. She had an order of protection. She moved out of state. She was in hiding. She had an attorney. Like, how did she die? How did a year go by and, no one was able to help her? And one of the things I clearly remember is growing up, my dad frequently would smack me in the back of the head, say, "Deborah Ann, God damn it, you have a brain, use it." And I remember starting to research stalking, looking at different law enforcement agencies, trying to figure out, what was going on in the world of stalking. And at this moment, I can remember thinking, I have a choice to make, that I can sit here and take in all the bitterness and the ugliness that I'm seeing in the world right now, or somehow, some way, I can do something to change things. And really, I didn't know what it was until I started telling my sister's story over and over again, especially to people that had come into our house and was asking us, what had happened. And, we were piecing more and more of the story together. The more I talked to Rachel, and, the story became longer and longer, what Peggy went through, and, how she was very calm at the end. And about, maybe about a couple weeks after Peggy's death, I apologize for the dog. She's the boss lady in our house. A couple weeks after Peggy's death, I was at home. My oldest was in kindergarten. I had a 2-year-old at home. We spent a lot of time watching Nick Jr. She walked out of the room. I thought, I'm going to turn the TV on, and on the TV was a girl. Her name was Tracy Baum. She was the director of the Stalking Resource Center in Washington, D.C., and I remember literally hauling ass from my living room to my computer, turning on my AOL, and typing the longest email about what had happened to Peggy. And I thought, no one in D.C. is ever going to call me back. Nobody's going to care about this. Well, Tracy cared and returned my phone call, and we talked extensively about what I wanted. And I remember thinking, what if we could have funding for dedicated officers to have stalking training, to work with stalking victims so they knew what the protocols were and they knew how to deal with these victims and they wouldn't fall through the cracks like Peggy had and so many other victims. And 2 days after that conversation, Tracy called me back and she said, Lifetime Television is producing a new show with Erin Brockovich, Ordinary Women's Extraordinary Lives. Would you be willing to share your story? Absolutely. And at this point, I was talking to really whoever, would listen. And so I got on the call with Lifetime and I told them Peggy's story, and they were so affected by what had happened to Peggy and our family that they had sort of brought all of these people to the table, not only Erin Brockovich and the Lifetime team, but Mark Wynn, who's one of the leading experts, I'd say, in stalking, especially dealing with law enforcement, and people from the Stalking Resource Center and the National Center for Victims of Crime, and Heather Wilson from the state of New Mexico. And we were all able to gather in Washington, D.C. in July of 2003, just about 6 months after Peggy was killed. And I had a conversation with Heather Wilson. And, one of the things she said to me is, Debbie, there are laws out there, but I think what's missing is education. And I thought, this is it. This is where Peggy's story is going to shine. That by telling Peggy's story, that in hopes that we would never, ever lose another life to the hands of a stalker. And so my family and I sat and watched Heather on the floor proclaim January is National Stalking Awareness Month. We made a roll call video. You can still find it on YouTube today. If you go to YouTube and you type Peggy Klinke in, the video will come up. That's still a wonderful training tool that we use today. I didn't really know where I was going to go with this, but I worked with the Stalking Resource Center for quite some time on their presentations. I worked in my home state of Ohio, frequently traveling through the state giving presentations, but I really, really found my home on college campuses with this 18 to 24-year-old age group, which is where we find our highest rates of stalking. But I really, really love college students, and one of the exciting things that I do say, because there are a lot of things that I look at and go, yeah, we're not doing very good work here. Nothing's changing. But you look at these kids on college campuses and their activism and their voice and how much they are speaking up and standing out and educating themselves, and campuses that are hosting me to talk to their faculty and administration about changing. This is where I really feel Peggy's legacy lies. One of the things that Patrick really wanted, was to shut her up, to take her life, to take her off the face of the earth. And the beautiful thing about this is that more people know Peggy now than they ever did before. And I think this is where I find my purpose. So I'm so happy and so honored to be able to share this story with you this afternoon. We will open it up if there's any more questions that have come in that I haven't seen that you want to know. And there'll also be my contact information at the end of this. If anybody wants to shoot me an email, please do. Please feel free.
Debbie, I think the only question besides an immense amount of gratitude for your strength and your ability to share your story. So lots of that being expressed in the chat. So I want to bring that to your attention. And then just a quick question from folks asking what happened to Mark, as well as did Patrick's family have any knowledge and what's happened with that?
Oh, what to talk about first? Well, Mark went to D.C. with us. He was involved early on. He was doing some activism work out in Albuquerque. He stayed in Albuquerque. He was out in San Diego for a while. And when the city or the police department in Albuquerque had gotten a new chief, Mark and I worked on a project with I think it was like a true Hollywood story about Peggy's story, and that was a really, really good project that we were able to work on with him. But shortly after that, he said, I can't do this anymore. They were to be engaged, I think that February. I think what Mark was waiting for was the trial to be over with. They were going to go to Hawaii. He ended up burying Peggy with the engagement ring. So he couldn't deal. As far as Patrick's family, I already told you the story about his mother. The only contact I ever had with the father was, after I had gotten the call about from the Turlock police officer, about what had happened out in Albuquerque, I called Patrick's brother and I told his wife what had happened. She didn't have very many words to say to me, so I let it go. And the next day, Patrick's father called my mother's house, and I was like, let me pick up that call. And his only thing that he could say to me was, I knew he was stalking her, I just didn't know how bad it was.
Thank you for sharing that, Debbie. Couple of questions. How are you doing? How do you take care of yourself?
Oh, well, this, I'll tell you this, doing this is my therapy. as ironic as it sounds, and this is something that I recognized early on, is that every time that I got to tell Peggy's story, it was like a part of my heart was starting to heal. I feel very empowered when I get to share this story with people, because for so long I was so helpless. I couldn't do anything for my sister. So for me, this, like I said, it's my therapy, but also, yes, I do, this does tend to, for lack of better words, kick my ass at times. That, I try not to schedule talk after talk after talk. I try to space them out. I try not to, well, not anymore. I'm not traveling, I'm not going anywhere, but, I kind of pick and choose where I will travel. I couldn't do this every day of the week, 5 days a week. I do need my downtime, but I truly love it, because I really, I feel like my sister's still with me when I get to talk about her.
That's awesome. Thank you, Debbie. And I'm sure everyone on the call shares my appreciation and my deep gratitude for you being able to continue to share Peggy's story. And I think you would appreciate knowing that lots of folks in the chat said that they share Peggy's story when they do stalking trainings and use her story as part of their training efforts. And so to kind of wrap things up, all of you had lots of really great questions. And I think the thing that we see throughout this presentation is people are saying, have things changed? What's different? What's better? What's not better? And the need, overwhelming need that we all see to continue to push forward awareness and training on stalking. And so one of the things that we want to consider is, what are our community responses looking like across the country? And many of you have identified, it looks very different depending on where you live and how that happens. And one of the things that we really want to focus on is, how do we continue to coordinate this response across the country? How do we continue to create awareness? The Stalking Resource Center was funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, and that is the agency that Peggy initially worked with. That funding is now given to SPARC, and so SPARC is in charge of that education and awareness across the country, and so that's why we use amazing advocates like Debbie to push this forward. But we also need all of you, so all of you that are in your communities doing this work, and so thinking about, how do we change this overall response and really work together as that coordinated response? And so one of the things that we really want to focus on is, as we're looking at these particular cases, how do we change that coordinated response? And looking at things like focusing on risk. Many of us identified that there were red flags, things that made it, the hair stand up on the back of our heads. And so how do we put that into practice? And so one of the things that we would recommend is using a stalking-specific risk assessment. And if you're not familiar with SHARP, which stands for the Stalking, Harassment, Assessment, and Risk Profile, it's a really great risk assessment that exists that can help us look at some of the risk in these particular cases. And so if you're interested in that, you can find it all over the SPARC website. You can see connections there, as well as really looking at training, which a lot of you have focused on. And so again, I would call your attention back to the training modules that we have on SPARC's website, where you can download that information and be able to use those PowerPoints, et cetera, in training your local communities. But also keep in mind that SPARC provides free trainings to people who get Office on Violence Against Women funding or are potential grantees. So pretty much anybody that works with victims or offenders as a community response, you can request a training from SPARC. Right now we're doing those virtually, hoping to get them back to those in-person trainings, but you can go to our website under training and request a training there, and somebody will be in contact with you. To that end, my colleague Dana Flightman, who's the other staff member full-time on our SPARC grant, is putting some great resources in the chat, so feel free to look at all the ones that she's putting up there for you. But keep in mind that we will post a recording of this particular training. So this training will be, it's being recorded. It'll be posted on our website under our archives. within about 7 to 10 days. Just depends on how quickly we get the recording back and put up on our YouTube site, so you can check that out. But for those of you that are like, we've got to change the system, there's really great guides on our website about changing the system, about providing training and guidance for corrections officers, for prosecution. And many of you identified that there's a need for additional training for law enforcement and other first responders. And that's one of the things that SPARC's in charge of, in doing training across the country for law enforcement, for college campuses, and others about responding to this issue. So the trainings are free. We do provide those for free, Claudia, so you can definitely check out our website and request a training there. But also, many of us have identified that we've got to increase awareness on an everyday level, right? And so looking at our social media and sharing that information about the response to stalking. Our kind of soapbox is that, January is amazing for creating awareness, but awareness on stalking and training on stalking needs to be a 12-month-long endeavor. So really making sure that we can continue to push information forward across the country about these particular efforts. And using Peggy's story as a learning opportunity to see where we have been with response and where can we go. I think we all can agree that there have been some improvements in some particular cases, but that is very much jurisdictional specific. And so how do we create more of that coordinated response across the country to identify and respond to stalking in the manner that it should be responded to, taken seriously, and looked at and analyzed. And so I'm going to forward through some of these slides, and so for those of you that are type A that are panicking that I'm not covering them, you have them all in the download below you. We wanted to make more time for Debbie's story today and her sharing about Peggy's experience. But I want to point out a couple of things to all of you. That assessment that I talked about, the SHARP assessment, the risk assessment, you can find at coercivecontrol.org or on our website. And it gives and looks at the risk factors that exist in stalking cases. And so you can put information in about a particular case and be able to include information about those particular cases and get a good assessment, as well as safety plans for these particular cases. So keeping in mind that that's an option, as well as some of the resources that we would point out to you and that we've put in the chat as far as advocacy and documentation. We have advocacy guides on our website. We have documentation guides on our website, so you can find this documentation guide on our website. And it has instructions in both English and Spanish, and has a really great way for victims to be able to keep documentation of these particular instances. So you can find that on our website. You can download it. You can use it in your work. And I see Dana busy linking all of these things in the chat, so I'm so appreciative that she's on. As well as some safety planning documents. So many of you identified that safety planning is extremely important in these particular cases. And so these are some strategies for increasing safety, both for those of you that are working in a professional capacity, but also if you have loved ones or friends or family that are experiencing something like this, there's some great guidance there as well. We also have videos on our website and documents that talk about, this is for friends and family. How do you support somebody that you know that's experiencing stalking? As well as I would point you to the fact that SPARC happens to be a project of Equitas, and Equitas is known as Champions for Justice and all violence against women issues. And so we have prosecutors that work to increase the awareness and response to stalking across the country. Some of you have noticed and identified that there could be additional work done within prosecutors' offices. So we have a prosecution guide on our website on how to prosecute stalking. We've got the guides for probation and parole officers on how to monitor stalking offenders, as well as information for those of you that are representing domestic violence and sexual assault organizations. One of the things that we know is that many victims of stalking struggle to find supportive organizations for what they're experiencing. And there's domestic violence and sexual assault organizations that exist across the country, but they too need to increase their response to stalking. So This has been a great way to look at your particular response in an organization and figure out, if you say you're working with victims of stalking, how do you increase the visibility of that work, and how do you enhance the work that you're doing on stalking within those particular organizations. And then, of course, last but not least, information on safety planning. And so we're going to leave you with a couple of things. Again, the Stalking Awareness website, as I've mentioned, this training is going to be recorded. It'll be available on our website within about 7 to 10 days, so you can access it and find that information there. I would also like to share Debbie's contact information again. Her website is stalkingmuststop.org, and you can send an email to stalkingmuststop@gmail.com. As Debbie mentioned, she's available for trainings and additional information, so please reach out to her. You've seen what an amazing job she does in sharing Peggy's story. And this is my contact information at SPARC. And to answer a couple of questions that always come up after webinars like this, if you have questions about materials, the recordings, et cetera, please reach out to us at SPARC versus the TA to TA folks. They won't be able to answer your questions. The other thing that people are always asking about is, can we get a certificate for attending the webinar? Yes, you can. Please, only if it's absolutely necessary. There were almost 400 of you on the webinar today. So you can imagine with a full-time staff of 2 people that printing out 400 certificates and emailing them to you is a little overwhelming for our staff. So if you absolutely need it, you can email me and we can get those out to you. But please be incredibly patient with us. January has been a wonderful opportunity to share information, and we've had lots of webinars, so we have lots of requests for certificates. So please be patient if that's something that you need. You can get the materials for this webinar downloaded below in that materials section. We've linked information about where to find Peggy's information. And again, Debbie's email is on the screen for you here at stalkingmuststop@gmail.com. And then I want to just turn it over to Debbie again for a last moment and closing thoughts. But again, huge gratitude, Debbie, to you for sharing Peggy's story and for the amazing work that you have done. We all exist in doing this work because of you and your family's efforts. So thank you.
I want to just tell everybody how appreciative I am of you spending your lunch hour or dinner hour, or I mean, I see people there from all over the world on this webinar. So I'm appreciative that you did take the time today to listen in, to learn, and hopefully you'll be able to take some of these tools that we talked about this afternoon and use them in your future training. So I know you're doing the hard work, and I appreciate everything that every single one of you are doing out there, because your job is not easy. But thank you, and know that you're appreciated.
All right, thank you, Debbie, again so much. Thank you all of you for attending today. We'll continue to stay on the chat for just a couple more seconds if any of you have additional questions. But again, thank you for spending your time with us, and thank you, Debbie, for sharing Peggy's story and for the amazing efforts that you've done throughout the last almost 20 years. So.